Good day to everyone, and thanks for listening into this new Gehring and Rosenzweig podcast. My name is Lee Gehring, and along with my partner Adam Rosenzweig, we are the founders and managing directors of the investment firm Gehring Rosenzweig Associates, a firm that's dedicated to both researching and investing in global commodity investment markets. As part of our investment process, we love to undertake huge amounts of insightful and what we like to consider to be original research that often comes up with investment conclusions that differ vastly from consensus. As I mentioned in our last podcast, as part of our research process, we love to recognize and identify emerging fundamental trends long before they are recognized by the general investment community. Our research and investment process is something we have been practicing now for over 30 years, and it's something that we here at Gehring and Rosenzweig are extremely proud about.
As investors in global energy markets, we have taken an intense interest in the climate debate, as well as in the expanding role of ESG movements and Wall Street's intense interest in the developing and rapidly evolving renewable sector. Over the last several years, we have spent significant time and effort studying renewables. And again, as we have done so many times in the past, we have rolled up our sleeves, so to speak, and delved deeply into the poorly understood underlying economic and energy fundamentals that are currently driving the renewable energy industry. And we have once again come away with conclusions that are vastly different from the consensus opinion.
In our last podcast, we laid out our premise that not only do renewables fail to accomplish their stated goals, that is, reduce the amount of CO2 emitted in the atmosphere, but in fact, after factoring in their vastly inferior energy return versus energy investment characteristics, we stated that investments made in renewables will make little progress in solving the CO2 problem. In fact, given the terrible energy efficiencies, we made the bold prediction that renewables could very well make things worse as we progress through this decade. And what's happening today involving the rapidly developing energy crisis is a prime example of what the future could very well hold. Also in our research endeavors surrounding renewables, we uncovered some fascinating characteristics in old technologies that not only have the ability to solve the CO2 emission problem, but because of their extremely high energy efficiencies, have the ability to substantially propel high levels of future economic growth.
In today's podcast, we will again drill down on the inferior energy in versus energy out characteristics of various renewable technologies. Also, and I think this is very interesting, we will place these inferior energetics within their historical context of economic advancement. We'll look back at energy's critical role over the last 2,000 years and its relationship with historic economic growth. And we'll take a closer look at energy's massive impact bringing about the 21st century society that we live in today. It's a fascinating historical journey that clearly shows energy's central role in producing the tremendous abundance that we've experienced in only the last 200 years. As you will see, if we decide to ultimately go down a renewable investment path, a path that today we seem determined to follow, not only will we fail to reduce CO2 emissions, but economic growth going forward through the 21st century will be almost impossible to achieve. Based upon our analysis, increased investments in renewables will produce a rare lose-lose situation. There simply will be no winners.
However, as we look out into the future, all is not dire, and there exist robust solutions that accomplish both reductions in both CO2 emissions as well as to provide as much energy needed to fund huge amounts of new economic growth going to the future. We will end our podcast describing how nuclear power can very well offer an almost nirvana-like solution to all our problems. Nuclear power not only solves the CO2 problem, but as you're going to see, it generates huge amounts of surplus power that will help generate huge amounts of additional economic growth. We are constrained by nature, and our conclusions often stand at odds with the prevailing wisdom, and our predictions are rarely popular when we first make them. We're sure that this podcast will produce much in the way of a similar response. And we should point out that it's not uncommon for investors to dismiss what we say out of hand, only to change their opinions and their positioning down the road.
A classic example of this is what's happening in global energy markets today. For most people, today's energy crisis has come out of the blue, but for Gehring and Rosenzweig, it is absolutely no surprise whatsoever. A little over a year ago, in our second quarter 2020 letter, released last July, we wrote an introductory essay entitled On the Verge of an Energy Crisis. No one agreed with us when we wrote that 14 months ago. However, as we all know, headline after headline talks extensively about a global energy crisis gripping today's world that has taken nearly everyone by surprise. Today, Lee and I will go into great depths about renewable energy and how it's unlikely to be the panacea to our energy and climate concerns. In many ways, today's energy crisis is due to the terrible energetics of renewables, a topic that we will discuss at length.
Today's discussion will ultimately focus on the future of energy, what roles wind and solar play in our economy going forward, and how will traditional energy must continue to play a huge part. The consensus believes that the future is electric and renewable, with solar and wind powering our homes, cars, and eventually airplanes. How do you like that? We strongly disagree. Instead, traditional energy, coal, gas, and more uranium will maintain the central roles in our lives. So with that in mind, we hope that you carefully follow the content in this podcast and think seriously about the investment implications we bring forth. As I just mentioned, we pride ourselves on our original research, and what Adam and I are about to share with you is some of the most original and most urgently pressing work we have done in our 30 years of energy investing. This is not a debate about carbon and rising temperatures. Instead, I will argue today that wind and solar simply cannot achieve the lofty goals they claim of providing abundant, clean, free power. Before we can understand the future of energy, we must focus on energy's past.
Few people ever think at all about energy, and even fewer think about its history. But it turns out that energy history is a fascinating topic, with several extremely engaging books dedicated to the subject. Vaclav Smil is perhaps the best known popular author on energy history, having been singled out by Bill Gates as one of his favorite authors. Richard Rhodes has also written a highly engaging volume on the history of energy, and I would recommend anybody interested in this subject to please go out and read both immediately. Charles Hall, on the other hand, has pioneered many of the more academic concepts I'll present to you today, and hopefully you will all get a sense of just how interesting and important energy history really is.
The first thing to understand about the history of energy is that for a long time, very little happened. In fact, few people realize just how similar our energy consumption was over thousands of years. Typically, we expect things to compound steadily over long periods of time, leading to fairly dramatic growth. But this has not been the case. For most of human history, energy came from human labor, which was powered in turn by food. Draft animals were first domesticated in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC and spread over the next 2,500 years. By AD 1, we start to have reliable data for Roman energy demand, and it's estimated that per capita energy demand was 16 gigajoules per year, which evaluates to about 10,000 calories per day. Food made up about a third of this, or 3,000 calories, as you might expect given the more vigorous lifestyles. Animals' feed was made up about 20%, while fuel in the form of wood made up the other half. The next 1,700 years saw incredible changes in many aspects of civilization. The fall of Rome, the Crusades, the Mongol invasion of China, the Renaissance, the printing press, the New World, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment. However, through it all, it is shocking how little changed in terms of energy consumption.
By the 17th century, energy demand had gone from 16 gigajoules to only 20 gigajoules, an increase of 25% over 1,700 years. Food consumption had stayed flat at about 3,000 calories a day, but it had dropped as a percent of the total. Animal use had increased slightly, as had fuel, the majority of which still came from wood, supplanted by the very early days of burning coal. Energy came almost entirely from food and wood, and so society depended greatly on the land. As a village grew, it required more and more land to sustain its population. Eventually, the energy required to bring the wood and grain from the farthest reaches exceeded the energy content of the food and wood itself, and the city could no longer grow. Rome in AD 1 was the world's largest city, and its fertile surroundings helped to support a population of 1 million people. By 1200 AD, the largest city in the world had moved from Rome to Hangzhou in China, but the population was still 1 million people. And even as recently as 1800, the world's largest city, Beijing, had a population only slightly above 1 million people. The reason, of course, was that exploiting the energy sources available at that time required large swaths of land, and ultimately, they could support a maximum population of about 1 million. Since society's energy use didn't change in 17 centuries, Neither did the size of its large cities. Something dramatic started to happen around the 17th century. Energy consumption began to rise dramatically.
The painting on the left is from the 17th century England and depicts a society that in many ways is similar from 3,000 years earlier. Compare that with the progress made in the last 350 years, a period 1/10 as long. Between 1 AD and 1650, the total energy demand grew by 0.04% per year, including population growth, or less than double in aggregate. Since then, it has surged 55-fold. That is not a mere issue of compounding. The compound growth rate increased by a factor of 20-fold between the two periods. Throughout human history, we relied mostly upon our own muscle strength. Full robust labor can generate 3 kilowatts per week. Today, in the OECD world, we consume 300 times that energy. It's as though we each have at our disposal 300 people working tirelessly for us. These have been dubbed energy slaves, and I think it really goes to show just how much things have changed over the last 3 centuries.
Prior to the 17th century, consuming anything more than what was needed to sustain human life required taking it from somebody else. Today, we live in a world of relative abundance, so much so that economists who love to study scarcity have dropped energy entirely from all of their models. This is not merely an abstract concept. Energy goes into every element of the economy. Food is converted as energy for labor. Fuel is converted to energy to mine raw materials and then process them into finished goods. Coal is used to make steel, and diesel and electricity are then used to take that finished steel and construct skyscrapers. It should be no surprise then to learn that real GDP began to surge at exactly the same time as energy demand. Between AD 1 and 1650, real GDP managed to triple, which represented a growth of 0.06% per year. But since then, it has surged 255 times. Again, 22 times the annual growth rate of the 17 centuries previous. Here's the relationship between energy demand and real GDP over the last 2,000 years. And as you can see, the R-squared is 0.98. Remarkable for something as complex as the economic activity over several thousand years. Several prominent academics actually go so far as to say that energy conversion, and by extension energy consumption, is in and of itself economic activity. There's no distinction. At the same time as GDP and energy demand surged, so did population. In AD 1, world population was estimated to be 300 million people. Average life expectancy was approximately 35 years and was skewed heavily by a very high youth mortality rate that achieved 40%.
By the 17th century, this had grown to 500 million people, or 67% over 1,600 years. Since then, global population has grown 15-fold to 7.7 billion as life expectancy has moved from 35 years to 75 years, and the youth mortality has fallen by 90%. So we have 2 periods here, one lasting 17 centuries in which things were remarkably static, and one in which energy consumption, wealth, and population growth all saw their levels rise 15-fold over 350 years. The change was so abrupt that a time traveler moving 2,000 years, arriving as late as 1800, would find many elements of modern civilization quite similar. Contrast with somebody jumping ahead 200 years from 1800 to 2000. The big question is why? The answer is simply fossil fuels. By figuring out how to harness the millions of years of concentrated solar and tectonic energy embedded in things like coal, oil, and natural gas, we're no longer limited by how much plant-based energy could be extracted from an acre of farmland or woodland.
Instead of playing a fundamentally zero-sum game, civilization was able to harness ever-growing amounts of surplus energy. Surplus energy was equivalent to surplus capital as the economy grew, and this surplus could be reinvested, triggering the power of compound interest and continued compound growth. For the first time in civilization, it was no longer a zero-sum game, but rather it became an exercise in optimized growth. It was not only that fossil fuels were abundant, they were also of a very high quality. What I mean by quality is that fossil fuels were easily accessible and required very little physical energy to extract, refine, and exploit. The concept of energy return on energy invested, or EROEI, tries to capture this relationship. EROEI is simply the ratio of how much energy is supplied to how much energy is used to supply it. The devil, of course, is in the details. One major distinction is where we draw the so-called boundary. For example, in a purely agrarian lifestyle, like was in place for most of human history, the EROEI at the crop or forest level was approximately 10 to 1. For every gigajoule of energy put into cultivating crops or cutting lumber, 10 gigajoules was harnessed. By the time efficiency losses throughout the economy were put into place, however, the so-called societal EROEI, or how much usable energy at the society level compared with how much was used to generate it, was probably closer to 5 to 1. We can use the concept of EROEI to help understand just how important the shift to fossil fuels truly was.
In 81, we consumed 17 gigajoules per person. We estimate that the EROEI was 5 to 1, meaning 3 gigajoules was spent generating the required energy. Food consumption was 4 gigajoules per year, or 2,500 calories per day. Other basic needs, including animal fodder and shelter, necessary for human survival, consumed approximately 10 gigajoules per year, leaving a net surplus of less than 1 gigajoule per year. The dynamic was largely unchanged for 17 centuries and resulted in de minimis growth, a doubling of total energy demand, or the miserable rate of 0.04% per year. Coal was the first fossil fuel to be exploited in earnest beginning in the 17th century, as wood supply in the UK was exhausted. In 1650, coal was already 1/3 of total energy consumed. Coal has a much higher EROEI than crop and wood-based energies, as high as 30 to 1. We estimate that the move to coal helped double societal's EROEI from 5 to 1 to 10 to 1. With a starting consumption of 20 gigajoules per person, only 2 gigajoules was needed to produce the energy, while food and basic necessities were unchanged. This helped increase the surplus in the economy from 1 gigajoule to more than 4 gigajoules. After having taken 1,700 years to double, the economy and energy demand quadrupled over the next 250 years.
And by 1900, per capita energy demand had grown to 25 gigajoules per year. High-quality coal deposits were joined by oil and natural gas deposits that also enjoyed EROEIs in excess of 30 to 1. As fossil fuels came to dominate the energy mix in the 20th century, society's EROEI increased yet again, eventually reaching 20 to 1. In other words, whereas 1 unit of energy had generated 5 units of usable power over thousands of years, that same unit now generated over 20 units of output. We estimate that in 1900, it took nearly 70% less energy to meet a person's energetic needs than it did throughout most of history, despite the fact that per capita energy demand had grown by 50%. To sustain per capita consumption of 25 gigajoules required only 1 gigajoule of energy. Food was still approximately 2,500 calories per day, and other basics were still about 10 gigajoules per year. This left a massive energy surplus of 10 gigajoules, and unsurprisingly, population, GDP, and total energy demand surged 13-fold over the next 120 years. This dynamic has created our modern world. Per capita energy today is 75 gigajoules, 3 times higher than it was in 1900. EROEI is still high at 15 to 1, so only 5 gigajoules is required to generate this base. That has left us with an unheard of surplus of 56 gigajoules per person, which was unfathomable throughout thousands of years of human history. The growth in the developed world has been even more dramatic. OECD energy demand is 175 gigajoules per person, or 7 times more than it was in 1900.
Energy growth is no longer tied to arable land in the same way. This means that cities are no longer capped at 1 million per person. Remember, Rome in the year 1 AD and Beijing in 1800 both had 1 million people. Tokyo today has a population of 21 million. The proliferation of large cities has been shocking. Until 1830, there was only a single million-person city at the time. London and Beijing shared the honor in 1830. However, there are 600 cities with over 1 million people today, and more coming every day. After having consumed very little refined metal for thousands of years, today we consume 1.8 billion tons of steel, 24 million pounds of copper, and 62 million pounds of aluminum, amounts so large they lose their meaning. Steel production alone would fill over 13,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. None of this would have been possible without high-quality, high EROEI energy. Unfortunately, our modern fossil fuel-based economy also generates CO2. 34 billion tons are released in the atmosphere every year and growing. Atmospheric concentrations have reached 410 parts per billion and are widely viewed as having contributed to rising global temperatures, although that could be a topic for another day. While energy policymakers around the world are today aligned on reducing CO2, their solutions put forward are simply not viable.
There seems to be a near universal agreement amongst policymakers today that wind and solar will simultaneously create jobs, reinvigorate economies, and reduce carbon emissions. But our work tells us something very, very different. Remember, I told you at the outset that our views might not be popular. Electric vehicles and hydrogen are also put forward as solutions, but ultimately they present the same problem. At the same time, a solution is likely hiding in plain sight: nuclear power. You might have guessed, the problem with wind and solar lies with their EROEI. They're simply nowhere near as good as coal or natural gas. Fossil fuels deploy 30 units of power for every unit invested. For wind and solar, it's closer to 3. Hopefully at this point you're beginning to understand why this is so important. Policymakers have chosen instead to focus on the dollar cost of renewables instead of on the energy cost, and this can be misleading for a few reasons. First, there's a feeling that costs only come down over time as technology follows some kind of Moore's law. On the other hand, manufacturing a ton of cement has required basically the same amount of energy now for years, and so the energy costs of renewables have hardly come down at all. Second, there's a feeling that any cost difference in monetary terms can simply be fixed with a subsidy or a tax. On the other hand, if it's a question of inferior energetics, there's simply no way to engineer around and redistribute all that difference. Take, for example, an average 1.5 megawatt windmill. It will operate at a 25% utilization rate, meaning that it'll generate 11 terajoules of power per year for its 20-year life, or about 220 terajoules in total. In turn, this will require 6 terajoules to produce the 200 tons of steel for the nacelles, 2 terajoules of power for the 15 tons of copper, and 5 terajoules for the remaining concrete and carbon fiber. In total, it will require 13 terajoules, suggesting a gross EROEI of 15, or off the bat, half that of fossil fuels. However, the windmill operates at such a low load factor that redundancy must be built into the system. Most engineers agree that a 2-to-1 redundancy is necessary. On top of that, battery backup is then needed to smooth out any variation, and all of this requires energy. A lot of it. Once this is all accounted for, the buffered EROEI of onshore wind drops to 4-to-1, or less than 75% lower than fossil fuels. Solar is even worse. A 1 megawatt rated solar installation will generate 89 terajoules of power over its life, assuming a 25-year life. And there's every reason to think that this life expectancy is overly optimistic. On the other hand, it requires 22 terajoules to construct. Most of the energy is consumed making the polysilicon, as well as preparing the site and eventually installing the units. Therefore, the gross EROEI for solar is only 4-to-1. However, solar, just like wind, is also intermittent, and it must be buffered. So once you account for the required redundancy in the battery backup, the buffered EROEI for solar drops to as low as 1.5-to-1. In other words, the entire facility will be hard-pressed to generate as much energy over its whole life as it takes to build it. Over the past month, silicon prices have jumped from $2 per kilogram to $10 per kilogram due to the power crisis in China, showing just how energy sensitive the solar supply chain truly is.
A major challenge with renewables is the fact that they are intermittent sources of power. Some other sources of electricity is needed to meet the periods when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. When renewables are a small part of the power mix, this isn't an issue as fossil fuels are able to handle the volatility. However, as renewables gain penetration, the intermittency issue needs to be addressed directly. The current UK power crisis is due in part to less wind than had been expected. Unfortunately, battery backup is itself extremely energy intensive. Lithium-ion batteries require a huge amount of energy to mine the copper, cobalt, and lithium. Even more energy is needed to then manufacture the battery. All this leads to a very low buffered EROEI for wind and solar backed up with lithium-ion batteries.
Today's so-called energy transition effectively involves leaving behind 2 sources of electricity, coal and natural gas, each with EROEIs of approximately 30-to-1, and moving towards two technologies, wind and solar, with EROEIs that are much lower. What does that mean for our future? Well, going back to our earlier analysis, today we consume 75 gigajoules per capita, and we enjoy a societal EROEI of approximately 15 to 1. So 5 gigajoules are therefore required to meet our energy needs. 4 gigajoules for food, 10 for other necessities, and that leaves us with an energy surplus of 56 gigajoules. This surplus has allowed us to lead our modern lives, and it comfortably sustains approximately 3% real GDP growth. If we move from fossil fuels with a societal EROEI of 15 to renewables with an EROEI of only 3 and maybe even lower, the effects would be dramatic. Instead of spending 5 gigajoules to meet our energy needs, we would need to spend 25 gigajoules. That would slash our surplus energy, which is to say all the energy we spend on things other than food and basic necessities, by 40%. It would also decimate future global growth. Remember that for most of history, we relied on an energy source with an EROEI of 5 to 1, and that in turn could support global growth of only 0.04%.
Today, we spend less than 7% of our total energy on producing energy. If we went to a renewable world, we would spend over 30%. It is impossible to divert that much productive energy away from the economy into simply generating more energy and expect the same levels of economic activity. While these figures might seem shocking to you, they actually agree with what many policymakers are proposing, although they are reluctant to say so. The International Energy Agency released its Sustainable Development Scenario to much fanfare back in October 2020. In their report, they believe that wind and solar will make huge inroads over the next 20 years. What was less expected, however, was that the IEA predicts that total energy available to end users will fall by 25% on a per capita basis between now and 2040. Moreover, they predict that total primary energy will fall modestly over that time. In other words, access to surplus energy will drop materially, and future growth will be impossible to achieve. We wonder how populations will respond once these realities begin to set in. I have spoken so far about energy generation, but obviously energy efficiency is equally important. Over time, new technologies tend to be adopted only when they can perform a given task with much less energy.
For 400 years, the only way to cross the Atlantic Ocean was by ship. By 1940, the RMS Queen Mary took 4 days and 1.5 million gallons of fuel to cross the Atlantic with its 2,139 passengers. This equated to a 5 passenger mile per gallon efficiency. In 1958, Pan Am started transatlantic service aboard its Boeing 707, and in so doing, ushered in the jet age. But while most people focus on the huge time savings, few people realize the fuel savings. The 707 flew with 24,000 gallons of jet fuel and a range of 4,300 miles, taking its 141 passengers comfortably to Europe with a fuel efficiency of 26 passenger miles per gallon, 5 times better than the Queen Mary. Within 10 years, air travel represented 95% of all Atlantic crossings. By 1980, the Boeing 747-300 could take its 400 passengers across the ocean on 2 levels with a fuel efficiency of 54 passenger miles per gallon, 10 times better than the Queen Mary did only 30 years before. Around that same time, BAC and Sud Aviation developed a true marvel of aviation, the Concorde. In almost every way, the Concorde was an incredible piece of technology. It could fly at 2 times the speed of sound, and it cut the travel time between New York and London by 60%. Many viewed the Concorde as the future of aviation and expected it to win market share from Boeing. Unfortunately, it was extremely fuel intensive. The Concorde held 34,000 gallons of fuel to take its 100 passengers a distance of 5,000 miles, resulting in a very poor 15 passenger miles per gallon. It's not surprising that it did not gain market share at all. But it also tells an interesting story. It could not simply have been time savings alone that helped cement the role of the 707. If it had been, then the Concorde would have been a success as well. Instead, it's fuel efficiency that's key.
EV today's is not dissimilar to the Concorde. We calculate that when renewable energy with its poor EROEI and factoring in the energy-laden lithium-ion battery, an EV requires 30 to 50% more energy per mile traveled than an efficient internal combustion engine. Unless that can be rectified, we do not believe EVs can be the answer. Hydrogen is being proposed as a way to get around the lithium-ion battery. Unfortunately, hydrogen is not found in nature and must be manufactured, which requires a huge amount of energy. Starting with the poor EROEI of renewables, we calculate an incremental 70% of the energy is consumed in the life cycle in making, transporting, and operating a hydrogen fuel cell. Clearly, this would make renewable plus hydrogen a completely unfeasible solution. Any solution must have a high EROEI and a low carbon intensity. Over the short term, natural gas has a comparable EROEI to coal with only half the CO produced. Switching from coal to natural gas would be the fastest way to reduce CO2 in the short term, although as recent events have shown, security of supply is an important issue. Over the medium term, the answer is nuclear power. The harnessing of nuclear power represents the most impressive feat in the history of energy, bar none. Even more important than the rise of coal in the 17th century. Nuclear power has an incredible EROEI of 100 to 1 and generates no carbon at its source. Just like fossil fuels increase societal EROI by a factor of 3 compared with food and wood, nuclear power has the ability to increase EROEI in society by another factor of 3. While some carbon would be emitted during the construction phase, a modern nuclear reactor would likely last 80 years and operate at 90% utilization, make the total carbon emissions incredibly small and de minimis. Despite the conventional sentiment, nuclear power is safe. On any metric, there are fewer incidents in nuclear power plant per unit of dispatch than any other source.
In recent months, it finally seems as though policymakers are waking up to the role nuclear energy must play in the future of energy. The first chapter in the history of energy spanned most of civilization and was notable for how steady it was. It was a period of short lifespans, difficult conditions, no surplus, and very little growth. The second chapter was one of accelerated growth as new and much more efficient sources of energy were harnessed. This period is responsible for the Enlightenment and for the birth of the modern world we enjoy today. We're on the verge of making a decision about our third chapter. Policymakers today are advocating, knowingly or not, a return to a world where energy surplus is dramatically reduced and growth is impossible to come by. We cannot believe that such a world will be willingly adopted, but we are dismayed to see how much traction these proposals have received to date. On the other hand, we have a solution hiding in plain sight, nuclear, which, if we adopted it in a widespread basis, would see our societal EROEI again increase by a factor of 3, not dissimilar from what we saw at the beginning of the 17th century. Just like that period ushered in a huge moment of seismic shift and prosperity and growth, we think that here too, if we make the right decisions today, we could enjoy a similar new period of growth going forward. Thank you very much.